Hey guys, it's Timothy here with Eldritch Moon just around the corner in about 4 or 5 days coming up on pre-release. I thought it'd be a very good time to go ahead and look at the entire set as a whole and pick out the cards that I thought were the best in their individual colors. So a couple things here. I'm not looking at rares. You can open a bomb in a pre-release and automatically know that it's a bomb or at least a decent card. What we're looking at is going to be the bulk of what you're opening in your sealed pool as well as the drafts you'll be doing after that. So I'm looking at the best commons and uncommons in each color. So the way I'm going to set this up is I'm going to do 2 honorable mentions for common and 2 for uncommon in each category or each color, and then I'll tell you what I think the 2 best commons and uncommons are for each color. So I'm going to kick it right off, and I'm going to start with the green cards, starting with the 2 honorable mentions. These cards are cards I consider good in the color, but not necessarily the best of the best. So these are cards that are solid. You'll pick them highly in draft, and they beat most of the rest of the color, but they don't quite reach what I think the top tier commons are. The first one I'm going to mention here is Bloodbriar. And this one might seem strange, but the thing is, if you ever get this guy going in the right sort of deck, he actually gets out of hand very, very quickly. He's a okay, not particularly exciting card on his own, but once you've sacked even 1 permanent, he comes up to a 3/4 for 3, and then he grows from there. This card can get out of hand in a number of decks. Imagine this card alongside something like Ulvenwald Mysteries or Ongoing Investigation, where you can continuously sack clue tokens to grow him. Not to mention black and white in Eldritch Moon have a good number of sacrifice and themes going on. So I think this card could actually be very good in the right kind of limited deck or the right kind of sealed pool. He doesn't quite reach one of the top commons because on his own he's not that good. He does need a deck to fit his purposes, but when you have that deck, this card is actually very good. The other honorable mention here, I know it's not technically a green card, but let's be fair, you're not going to play this in a lot of your non-green decks. It does make for a good splash outside of green, though. That card is It of the Horrid Swarm. It's an 8 mana 4/4. When you cast it, you get 2 1/1 insect creature tokens. So a total of 6 power and toughness across 3 bodies. And of course, it has the emerge cost of 6 and a green. So you can sacrifice a permanent and reduce its emerge cost to cast it even earlier than that. I've been using the sweet spot of 3 mana. As the type of creature I would often be okay sacrificing to an emerge card, which usually reduces the cost of that emerge creature to about 4 mana. It of the Horrid Swarm for 4 mana seems like an insane deal. It reminds me of Rakshasa Death Dealer, or not Death Dealer, Gravecrawler from Dragons of Tarkir, which was just so much power and toughness, but did require you to sacrifice a card. Also note how Emerge works with Bloodbriar. Sacrificing creatures triggers that card. It doesn't quite beat what I consider the top 2 commons in green. The first one is Ulvenwald Captive, and if you're looking at just this card on face value, it might actually seem weak, but from my experience, 2 mana dorks, and especially in green, are very, very high picks when it comes to draft. They're very useful and sealed, and in this format especially, where you want to be ramping ahead to some of your big creatures or some of your transform creatures, having a mana dork to do that at the common level is exactly what you want. It's not the most impressive flip card, and it's never attacking on its face side due to Defender, but it is such a solid mana dork in a set that does not have a lot of creature-based ramp. You're just not going to find a lot of other replacements for this card. Think of a good number of the last couple of sets. Hedron Crawler, Golden Hind, Leaf Gilder, a number of cards that cost 2 mana and then tap for mana. This gets you your 4-drop out early, and when this does transform, sure, you get a 4/6 on the backside that taps for more mana. So this has early game utility and late game utility, making it a very, very solid common to pick up. I promise you this card will not come super late in most drafts. What I consider the actual best card in green for commons is Prey Upon. This card was great last time it was printed. It's just a 1 mana sorcery speed fight. Of course, fight spells are a little bit worse when they don't actually give a boost on top of the fight, but Prey Upon is so efficient in a color that lacks removal that it just has to be the best common. I think it is close between the top commons here, but I think Prey Upon takes the top spot. Moving on to the uncommons, the first honorable mention I'll say is Gnarlwood Dryad. This is just a solid 1/1 Death Touch for 1. Could easily be a common card if it weren't for the Delirium, which makes it a 3/3 Death Touch once you've hit 4 card types in your graveyard. This isn't a particularly amazing card. You're never going to win with just this card, but as I've noticed, 1/1 Death Touches for 1 mana, even 2 mana, tend to let you build up a board. A lot of people will not attack into a card like this, and you can actually get free damage off of it a lot of times. So it's a very, very nice 1-drop that has a little bit of late game utility. A 3/3 is not, going to break the game for you, but it is a nice reward once you no longer really need the 1/1 Death Touch there. So very solid pickup. It is better in Delirium-based decks, but I imagine most green decks will play this card regardless of whether they can achieve Delirium or not. Kessig Prowler just barely misses what I consider the top 2 best uncommons for green. This is a very solid card for werewolves, and I'm sorry, maybe the power and toughness is cut off here. Kessig Prowler is a 1 mana 2/1, but it's in green, and green doesn't often get these sorts of creatures. It's also in the werewolf theme, which was lacking very good 1-drops when it came to Shadows over Innistrad. On the backside, it turns into a 4/4 that must be blocked, which is well worth 5 mana. So if you can get a couple hits off this and then be able to flip it so it can keep attacking, it definitely justifies its spot in pretty much any green deck, and you'll be super excited to play it in your werewolf-based deck. As for top 2 uncommons, I have no doubt in my mind that Clear Shot is the best uncommon in green in this entire set. I would definitely argue that point with a lot of people. This card is absolutely insane, so much to the point where I felt like I had to reread it a couple times. Rabid Bite was such a great common card in Shadows over Innistrad as a one-way fight mechanic, and that was sorcery speed. This asks you to pay 1 more mana, but does so much more than Rabid Bite. It gives you a power and toughness boost, and like I just said with Prey Upon, your fight spells are much better when they give you a power and toughness boost, except this one isn't even a fight spell. You just hit the creature and they never hit back. So think of like a Tail Slash or Fall of the Hammer type effect. These effects are really, really good in green, and the fact that this is instant speed and gives you +1/+1 on top of that is absolutely incredible for green. Very, very solid card, and an upgrade to Rabid Bite is a little surprising as well. But this is probably one of the best quote-unquote fight spells we've seen in a very long time. Better than I have in recent memory. This is rivaling the power level of something like, I don't know, the Nissa's whatever, the support card from Oath of the Gatewatch, support 2, and all your creatures fight. It's not as powerful, but at 3 mana in an instant, it's very strong. Somberwold Stag just barely, I think, beats out Kessig Prowler, even though I think it's very close. It's a 5 mana 4/3 elk creature. When it comes down, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So what this is often going to do is come down and beat up a 2/2 or something like that, or maybe your opponent has a big wall like an 0/4 or 0/3 sitting around that you've been having trouble getting through, and this will just come down, add a lot of power and toughness to the board while taking out an opponent's creature. Sometimes you'll use it to take out something even bigger. A lot of times, I wouldn't mind playing this and taking out like a 5/4 or a 6/4 or something along those lines. So you may use it as just a removal spell, or if the situation calls for it, you may not use the ability at all. It is, in fact, a May ability. This is as close as green gets to something like Flametongue Kavu or Necrotal or Shriekmaw. A decent-sized body with a fight effect or a removal spell effect on top, and if you have to use this as a 5 mana deal 4, then that's fine too, even if you don't keep the elk behind. The ideal situation is play it, kill something that's going to survive, and then, you have a 4/3 on board. Also want to point out that this card is incredible with the number of blink effects in this format. Long Journey Home exiles a creature and then puts it back on the battlefield with a 1/1 counter. That is insane with this card. So I think it is very close between the Stag and the Kessig Prowler, but I think the Stag is going to be consistently a better card for green decks, whereas Prowler will be consistently better for werewolf decks. Moving on to red, looking at the commons, the first card I'll mention is Alchemist's Greed, and this strikes me as a very good card. It's 5 mana to deal 4 to a creature, but you can madness it for 2. And as I mentioned in my full spoiler video, This is very, very similar to Boulder Salvo from Oath of the Gatewatch, which was 5 mana deal 4, but you could surge it for 2, meaning if you had already cast a spell that turn, you could pay 2 mana instead of 5. This is very similar, but it's much, much easier to madness a card in red than it is to surge a card a lot of the times. The reason this doesn't reach one of the top commons is because it's actually at its peak in madness base deck, so something like red-black or blue-red, whereas something like red-white or red-green may not have the tools available to discard this and get the full value off of it. If you can reliably madness, this is probably one of the best red cards in the entire set, but if you're struggling to discard this card, then a 5 mana deal 4 is still decent, but not quite as good as it could be. Similarly, we have Galvanic Bombardment, which is 1 red to deal 2 damage to a creature plus an additional damage for each Galvanic Bombardment in your graveyard. Now, the reason this doesn't crack the top is mostly for sealed and draft purposes, where if you only get 1 of these, maybe even if you get 2, it's not the best thing in the world. 1 damage to a creature for 1 mana is good. 2 damage or 3 damage to a creature is in fact good, but if you only get 1 of these, it's not insane or anything like that. People will probably be fighting over this card quite a bit, just like its blue counterpart, so I wouldn't expect to pick up the deck where you have 3 or 4 or 5 of them. And as well as sealed, if you only pull 1 of these, obviously the power level is much, much lower. It's still a serviceable card on its own, but gets better in multiples, but I can't say it's the best common because it needs others to go with it. First common I'll call one of the best, and this is a card I'm excited to try out. Maybe I'm wrong about this one, but I was very, very surprised when I saw the backside of this card. Vilden Pack Outcast is 5 mana for a 4/4 trample, which is already a decent rate. For red mana, you can give it +1/-1, so technically for 3 mana, you can make it a 7/1 for the turn with trample, which can deal a lot of damage. And for 7 mana, it transforms into a 5/7. I'm sorry I didn't put the flip side here. A 5/7 with 1 mana, give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So essentially fire breathing. The backside of this card is extremely powerful. Imagine you've already gotten up to 7 mana to play or to transform this card. You can easily dump 7 mana into it the following turn once it's transformed, and that gives you a 12/7 trampler. Yes, the backside has trampler as well. I am excited to play this card if I'm in red. I think it's a good alternative and even maybe an upgrade to something like Gatstaff Arsonist as far as the 5-drop slot goes, and I feel like it is easily an uncommon quality card. It just does a lot. It has the potential to deal so much damage, which is what red wants to do with its 5-drops. The other card here is a little innocuous, but I think it deserves one of the top spots. Brazen Wolves is 3 mana for a 2/3 wolf. When it attacks, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Let's be honest, you're playing red, so you want to be attacking a lot. This is a huge upgrade to something like Hellpack Alpha or Hellpack whatever the card is, the 3/3 that can't block unless you control a wolf. This card, if it's attacking, is a 4/3, which is insane for a 3-drop common. If you get these in multiples, it can deal tons of damage over the course of a couple turns, and it's going to force your opponent to start chumping or actually put something really large in the way of it to trade with it. I'm surprised this wasn't printed as a 1/3 and upgrades to a 3/3. It's a 2/3, so if you have to block with it, it blocks other 2/3s well, but the fact that it attacks through other 3/3s and 2/3s is really, really nice. I think it's a very strong common, and it's something you shouldn't ignore. Uncommons, Spread in Flames, I think, is a card that I could go back and reevaluate once I've played the set a lot. I was tempted to give it one of the top 2 spots, but the reason I can't do that is because it is 7 mana, and there are matchups where this card is not going to be good. There are 7 toughness and 7+ toughness creatures in this format, as well as creatures with a good number of transform creatures and emerge cards with 6 or higher toughness. This card doesn't kill those, or at least trades 1-for-1 with those. Paying 7 mana to kill a single creature is not good. Of course, Spread in Flames still deserves an honorable mention here because it will almost 80-90% of the time be better than that, and at least 2 or 3-for-1 your opponent. 6 damage to divide up is quite a bit, and if your opponent is in some sort of go wide strategy, this can be a devastating card for them to see. Smoldering Werewolf is also another card that I'm going to have trouble evaluating until I've actually played the set. The reason I haven't given it one of the top 2 spots is because I don't know how relevant 1 damage to 2 target creatures is going to be. It does flip into a decent creature, but 6 mana for a 4 toughness creature is quite a bit when 4 toughness creatures are a little easier to kill. The flip side does also deal 2 damage to something whenever it attacks, which is pretty good, but it requires a pretty good investment. Now, if that first ability here, the ETB ability on Smoldering Werewolf, proves to be really good, then this card will definitely go up in value. But I've even given it one of the top 4 spots in my opinion here as far as uncommons in red go, and I think it's well deserving of that. If you ever kill a creature with the ETB effect, it's definitely justified its spot. If you have to play it as a 4-mana 3/2, well, it gets a little bit worse. Incendiary Flow is, in my opinion, probably one of the strongest red cards here. I can see people debating this, and it might be questionable that Incendiary Flow comes in over Spread in Flames. To be honest, the art looks very, very similar. But Incendiary Flow gets the nod to me because it is just decent creature removal in a format that's going to be dominated by the early game, but is going to have a lot of late game shenanigans going on. Yes, this card falls off a little bit in the late game if your opponent's playing a big creature deck or a werewolf-based transform deck, but this card is so efficient, even as a sorcery, being able to deal 3 to an opponent to finish a game, or 3 to a creature in exile is pretty good. Not to mention exile and things is a decent thing. So Incendiary Flow is very, very strong. Doesn't require quite the investment that Spread in Flames does, but I could see these 2 cards being interchangeable. The final card I'll mention here, and one that I'm really excited to play in an aggressive deck, is Savage Alliance. In my opinion, probably even better than Incendiary Flow. What it does is for 3 mana you get to pick one of the modes and escalate an additional mode for each 1 mana. So at 5 mana, you can pick all 3 modes. The first mode gives trample to all of your creatures or to target player. The second mode deals 2 to a creature, and the last mode deals 1 to each creature your opponent controls. Now, just looking side by side with Incendiary Flow, this automatically does 3 damage to a target creature for 4 mana, as well as 1 to each other creature, and that's already a very, very good card at instant speed. 3 damage to a creature plus 1 to all other creatures. I would rather have this than Smoldering Werewolf a lot of the times if I'm trying to pick off 1 toughness creatures. The first mode, however, works pretty nicely with the other 2. I mentioned this in the full spoiler video for red as well. If you're attacking with a bunch of things and you're trying to trample more damage in, the second and third modes go very nicely with that. Since creatures will already have damage marked on them, you only have to assign 1 less damage to each creature that was blocked, or 3 less to the one that you dealt 2 damage to. This card just seems very good, and that means that the trample damage goes through and deals a lot more. Essentially 1 extra trample damage on each creature that was blocked. Very, very good. Pretty versatile. You don't want to be using this as a 3-mana shock, but you can definitely at least use the second and third modes together to pick off a good number of small creatures in the format. I think it's a very good card. Maybe I'm over-evaluating it, but it seems like a very solid trick for red. Moving on to black, the first comment I'll mention is Gavony Unhallowed, and this is a card that I think I'll have to test out before I definitely say how strong it is. I have my eye on it, and I have a feeling that a lot of games will have this come down in pre-release, and people will look at it as an unassuming card, and then they'll start getting wrecked by it once it has 2 or 3 counters on it. So it comes down as a 2/4 for 4, and whenever another creature you control dies, it gets an additional 1/1 counter. Well, I would definitely play 4 mana for a 3/5. That seems fine even as a vanilla creature, and I would absolutely play 4 mana for a 4/6 that just grows from there. So this creature is like what Unruly Mob wants to be. Unruly Mob gets outpaced in this format so quickly, whereas this card has the initial toughness to keep it around. It reminds me just like Bloodbriar or Pyrehound, a creature that may be a little underwhelming on its surface, but once you get that first counter, it's already very worth the initial investment. This card is actually quite strong. I would expect it to get out of hand in a lot of games, so don't let this one go unnoticed. I have a suspicion that it's going to be a good card. Certain Death is tied for honorable mention here. Certain Death is very costly, but it is a sorcery. It's a sorcery as well, but it does kill a creature, and it does give you a 4-point life swing, potentially making up for some lost tempo. Unconditional removal is still good, even if it's expensive, especially simple cards that say just destroy instead of dealing damage. This will let you deal with a big Eldrazi or a flipped werewolf or something that's flying above you and getting out of hand while also giving you that life swing. So while it is expensive, removal is king for a reason, and it's because of cards like this. Even at 6 mana, it's still a decent card. Top commons, Boon of Emrakul. I may be wrong about this. I'm not a big fan of enchantment-based removal, but killing a creature with 3 toughness or less seems worth the 3 mana investment. I would happily play 1 or 2 of these in my main deck anytime I was playing black. And of course, there is a lot of removal in black. People will be fighting over it, so sometimes you'll have to settle for this card over, say, I don't know, a card I'll mention in the uncommons here, but it's still solid at what it does, and you still have that very, very slim percentage of a time where you'll use it to actually pump a creature, maybe even a creature with trample, and push in that 3 extra damage. So I think it's well deserving of one of the top spots here, and I think it is consistently better than Certain Death in most situations. Succumb to Temptation is probably one of the best commons. I'm willing to say it may be the best common in black. It's just a very efficient draw spell. Black, yes, you usually lose life to draw cards in black, but that's to be expected at this point. It's essentially 3 mana, you draw 2 and lose 2, but the instant speed makes it quite good. In a controlling deck, maybe blue-black, white-black, or something like that, you are able to hold this up in addition to other cards, and you can simply cast it when the time is right to refill your hand. Cards like that go unnoticed a lot of the time, and they end up being really good. Of course, you can't afford to just grab 4 or 5 of these and jam them into your draft deck, but 1 or 2 will definitely fit the 3-drop slot nicely. Moving on to uncommons. Honorable mention, Haunted Dead. This is a 4-mana 2/2, and it comes in with a 1/1 spirit creature token on the battlefield as well. I mentioned this when it was spoiled very early on, that creatures like this are often really good. Usually they're around 3 mana, but they're usually around the same body. You get a 2/2 and a 1/1 flyer or something like that, or a 2/1 ground creature and a 1/1 flyer, but those cards have always been consistently good. It will remain to be seen if a 4-mana version of that card will do it in this format. It is a completely different format, so you can't just say because a card was good before, it will be again. It could be a completely different case, but I'm willing to bet this card is strong, and the reanimation ability on it just gives you extra value by pitching lands or using it as a Madness Enabler or Delirium Enabler or something along those lines. Ruthless Disposal is a card that I'm willing to bet is very, very strong, but I'll need to test it out first. It does ask you to do quite a bit in exchange for killing 2 creatures. So 5 mana at sorcery speed, sacrifice a creature, discard a card. That's quite a bit of a cost, but it essentially kills 2 different creatures, right? So -13, might as well say destroy 2 target creatures in most situations, and that's probably worth the initial cost that you're paying here. But the reason I can't give this one of the top spots is because sometimes you're unable to pay all those costs, or sometimes it's just not a payoff in general. If you are sitting around with your biggest creature on board and that's the only thing you can sacrifice, you're not going to want to cast this card. Or if the best card in your deck is floating around in your hand and it's the only card, again, this card gets a little bit worse. But it probably is strong enough that it's willing to move up in value over time. So card I'm really looking forward to testing out, looking to see what other people's opinions are about it. It's very strong, obviously. It has a lot of potential, but it does ask a lot of you. Murder is almost certainly, in my opinion at least, the strongest uncommon in black. It is unconditional removal. It is instant speed. It's a little hard to splash, which is nice, which means that black players should be able to grab this card without getting ganked from somebody just trying to grab it for their 4-color control deck or something like that. But I can't really say much else about the card other than it's really good, especially with a format with giant creatures in it. So Murder is uncontested king of the black cards here as far as uncommons go, in my opinion. You may disagree, but I don't see any uncommon that's quite rivaling it. Abundant Maw is my second pick for strongest uncommon. I see a lot of people, they look at these emerge cards and they say, well, you're not going to be able to emerge it most of the time, or if you're sacrificing a creature, you're losing value. This is true, but this card is so strong, and yes, I know it's not a black card, but again, you'll play it mostly in your black decks. But these cards are so strong, and sacrificing a smaller creature is well worth what you get off of them. This is essentially a Siege Rhino without Trample, and it's on a cast trigger, so you still get that 6-point life swing even if it's countered. You can play this as early as turn 4 in most decks, and it's just very, very solid. Even for 8 mana, this would be an okay card, not exciting. But the fact that you can cast it for 4 mana or less is pretty insane, and I think it's well deserving of one of the top spots here. Moving on to blue. Blue has quite a few good commons, nothing that's really blowing me out of the water, no pun intended, but the first one I'll mention is Spontaneous Mutation. This is very just efficient card. It's not that it's super powerful, it's just efficient. It's 1 blue for a flash aura, and the enchanted creature gets -X/-0, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard. So this doesn't do anything early in the game, but this essentially pacifies a really big creature when it comes to the mid or late game. Yeah, the creature can still attack, it can still block, sometimes -X may not be enough to shrink it to 0, but it is good enough as a pseudo removal spell, or at least a type of card that makes a problematic creature easier to deal with. So this is good in multiples. It simply asks you to be casting spells or trading creatures so that you actually have cards in your graveyard. But when you get those cards going, even if it's 3 or 4 cards, this card is definitely worth 1 mana, and Flash really puts it over the top as a common. Take Inventory is on the blue honorable mention list for the same reason that the red version is on the red list, because as a single card, actually in this case Take Inventory is actually quite bad if you only have one of them, whereas Galvanic Bombardment is decent for the first one. Take Inventory is not good for the first one, but once you get the second one, it's actually really good. It requires you to play the first one and kind of lose a little bit of tempo for a 2-mana cantrip, and then later on rewards you by playing others. But again, it can't get one of the top spots here because it does require you to have multiples in order to be good. So in a sealed pool, if you open only one, you probably won't play that one at all. Top blue commons. Exultant Cultist is not a particularly exciting card. It doesn't actually do anything new or extraordinary, but it is an efficient card. You'll happily trade it with a 2/2. You'll happily trade it or sack it to some sort of effect that you have, and then it'll replace itself. Cards like this are usually pretty good. This fits very, very nicely with emerge cards, again being a 3-drop, so rewarding you for playing that turn 4 emerge card. This is just an efficient card, and I think it's well deserving of a top spot, although I can see it being pushed a little bit under in a world where there are a lot of 2/3s. This card is not going to be able to attack a lot and may not be able to favorably trade, so this is one of the ones I'm a little bit speculative on. Ingenious Scab, however, I'm very confident deserving one of the 2 spots here. This is a 3-mana 2/3 Prowess, essentially a Water Courser. It has the +1/-1 ability for blue. Prowess works very, very nicely with that ability, and this card can deal a good chunk of damage. This could easily have been a 4-drop or an uncommon card with the same stats. Prowess really makes this card good, and it gives blue a particularly good beater at a very early stage in the game. Moving on to uncommons, these were pretty hard to sort out. The first one I'll mention is Scour the Laboratory. Again, it can't get a top spot here because there are some decks where it's just not good. 6 mana to draw 3 cards is borderline not particularly great. It's usually, it is worth a card to draw 3 cards even if it's an expensive card, but you can definitely do better than 6 mana to draw 3, especially with things like Pore Over the Pages in the format. But it is still one of the strongest cards if you can get to Delirium, because a 4 mana draw 3 at instant speed is pretty insane. That 2 mana does make a huge difference, and you should do everything you can to make sure you enable Delirium if you plan on running this card. Geist of the Archives. I might get a couple frowns for this one, but I am confident this is a very strong card. It doesn't look like it, but just that ability to passively filter on your upkeep is good, especially on a creature that's not going to die too easily. It blocks very, very well early in the format. I would be happy tapping out on turn 3 to put this guy down, and it's very hard to interact with. It isn't going to do too much on its own throughout the course of the game, so your deck needs to be good to make it good, but filtering through cards is really, really good. Over the course of 3 or 4 turns, you will improve your draws with this card, and it's definitely worth that spot on the curve. For uncommons, I put Advanced Stitchwing as one of the top uncommons in blue, which might be a little surprising because it doesn't actually work with a lot of strategies well, other than just being, you know, that same pay mana, discard 2 cards, put it on the battlefield tapped. The reason I think it's one of the best uncommons is because it's actually just a really powerful flyer for blue. There are better cards, of course, but most of them are rares, and most of the cards that'll be able to take this down in combat are big flyers at rare level or something like that. As far as uncommon flyers go, this is one of the strongest ones, especially for blue, where most of the flyers are spirits with low toughness. So I like this card quite a bit. I don't think it's particularly special in any sort of way, since it does have a replaceable ability, but its stats on a flying body are pretty good for a color that could use a card like this. And then finally, Drownyard Behemoth in blue. I don't think I'm cheating on the emerge cost here, because I would absolutely not play this card for 9 mana outside of a blue deck. So I would either be looking to splash this card off of blue mana, or definitely play it in my blue deck. It has flash, and when a misconception here is that it would enter the battlefield and then gain hexproof. It actually doesn't work that way. It's just as soon as it hits the battlefield, it has hexproof until the end of the turn. So there's very little interacting with this card the turn it comes down, and it has high stats enough to be able to eat up a creature in combat. This is well worth the creature you sacrificed for it, especially if it's something that's giving you value off of being sacrificed in the first place. This is a very, very powerful uncommon, a 5/7 flash creature for essentially somewhere up to, 4 or 5 mana is what I'm looking at this at. So disagree with me if you would like. Maybe you think the emerge cards are not worth sacking a creature, but this one in particular, I would say, definitely takes one of the top spots for uncommon in blue. Even though it's not a blue card, I do think you'll play it more consistently in your blue decks. As powerful as it is, it's not that great for 9 mana, but when you can cast it for 4 or 5 mana, it is a huge blowout of a card. And that leaves the white cards. I will say now that I believe white has the best commons and uncommons in the set overall. It may not have the best common or the best uncommon, but it definitely overall has a high quality of cards. I had a lot of trouble deciding which cards I was going to put on this list for white. The first one I'll mention is Fiendbinder. It's a 4-mana 3/2 that taps a creature when it attacks. Taps a defending player's creature specifically. These type of cards are usually pretty good, and it's definitely better than just a generic tapper if you want to be aggressive. It has a nice power. It has 3 power, and it is a little weak on toughness, but the fact that you can tap down the thing that would make it trade down, you can tap down a 2/2 or something like that, means that this is often going to get in damage, or at least pose some sort of block where the rest of your creatures are going to get in damage. Not to mention, if you get multiples of this, it can really go crazy and push in tons of damage while leaving your opponent defenseless. So it's good in a race. It takes out problematic blockers pretty nicely, and I think it's an altogether solid common card. The other one I'll mention goes in the same kind of deck. Steadfast Cathar is a 2-mana 2/1 that gets +0/+2 when it attacks until end of turn. I'll mention in this card for white the same reason I mentioned the 2/3 that gets +2/+0 in red when it attacks, because it's so good on that point in the curve. If you're playing this card at all, or you're playing some sort of white human deck, you want to be attacking a lot, and that essentially makes this card a 2-mana 2/3. It does drop off a little bit if your opponent has effects that can deal 1 damage, which just in this video alone, we have seen a good number of effects that can definitely punish you for playing a 2/1 for 2. But at its very minimum, it's a bear, and it is going to attack for 2 no matter what. If you are on the play, this card gets a lot better where it can start swinging as a 2/3, and I'll be very, very happy to play multiples of these in my aggressive white decks. Top commons. I didn't mean to hit that twice, but there you go. Desperate Sentry is very, very surprising to me for a common. It's 3 mana. It could easily cost more than that for the total amount of effects it gets. But it's a 1/2 when it dies, it replaces itself with a 3/2 token, which is already good. I'm borrowing Delirium here because a lot of times you'll just chump this thing very, very early, or you'll use it to sacrifice for some sort of effect and replace itself and get value. But if you ever get to the point where you have Delirium, it gets +3/+0, which makes it a 4/2 for 3, a very good card that still replaces itself with a 3/2. A 3/2 is worth 3 mana, so there's no reason this card shouldn't be worth 3 mana. I think this is a very, very good card. Could easily be an uncommon and works very, very nicely in a lot of things that white is trying to do as far as attacking goes, as far as Delirium goes, and as far as sacrificing creatures go. It's very versatile and fits into a lot of different strategies for the color. Choke and Restraint is kind of an expensive pacifist. It's 3 mana to enchant a creature, and the creature cannot attack or block. Even at 3 mana, Pacifism still a good card. That extra little bit is just a little bit of gravy for the most part. It's 5 mana to exile the creature that's enchanted. That could be relevant if you have cards in your deck that could retrieve enchantments from the graveyard, or if you need to get Delirium by putting an enchantment in the graveyard that gives you an out to do so. So I don't think it's super relevant to use that ability most of the time. Maybe if you just have 5 mana open, you'll pop it off, but on its basis is the 3 mana Pacifism, which I still think is a good card. It baffles me that Pacifism is usually a common card. Pacifism could easily be an uncommon, and I think so could this. It's not quite as good as Bound by Moonsilver, but it's definitely as good as anything like Sleep Paralysis or similar kind of lockdown enchantments. Finally, we have the white uncommons. This was the hardest one for me to do here because white has so many really good uncommons. So if you disagree with the order, let me know in the comments below what you think the strongest cards are in white, or the other colors for that matter. First honorable mention, Faith Unbroken. I think a lot of people would probably peg this as one of the best uncommons. I definitely do, but I think that there is risk involved with playing this card. It doesn't do anything particularly special as far as getting around the problem with auras goes, and if your opponent can deal with the creature that's enchanted, or if they can deal with this enchantment, it's almost like you never played it at all. It does, however, do quite a bit for an uncommon, and presents a pretty good blowout if you play it at the right time. So it's a card you have to be careful with. Sometimes there are boards where you can't cast this, or it's just not good, or your opponent has a lot of open mana and you know they're playing Murder and Throttle in their deck, so you can't jam it on a creature. But when this sticks, it should be good. Exiling a creature of your opponent's while also giving one of your creatures +2/+2 is very strong. Just be careful with the blowouts with this card. If they deal with your creature, well, they essentially just 2-for-1 you. Like they would for any other aura. Extricator of Sin took the spot here, just narrowly beating out maybe 1 or 2 other cards that could have easily taken its spot. Extricator of Sin is very strong. It's a 3 mana 0/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another permanent to get a 3/2 horror Eldrazi creature token. So already, if you're able to sacrifice a permanent, you're getting 3 power and 5 toughness worth of creatures for 3 mana and whatever permanent you sacrificed. Obviously, if you're in a situation where you can't afford to sacrifice a permanent, this card drops off quite a bit. But it has the added bonus that if you have Delirium at the beginning of your upkeep, you can flip it into a 3/5 that lets you sack additional permanents to make more 3/2 Eldrazi horrors, while also giving the rest of your Eldrazi creatures vigilance. So altogether, it's very worth 3 mana. I would happily sacrifice a permanent to get that 3/2 in most situations. If it combos with anything else that wants me to sacrifice permanents, then it gets even better. For instance, Extricator of Sin goes extremely well with Desperate Sentry. That's 2 3/2s for a total of 6 mana. Really, really good, on top of the 0/3. Not to mention that sacrificing a permanent does get you closer to Delirium already, assuming you're sacrificing something like a land or an artifact. I don't know. But I think it's a very solid card. moving on, we'll go ahead and look at the 2 uncommons, and the first card that I will say is one of the best uncommons, something you should almost always play in your white decks, is Subjugator Angel. This card is bonkers for a uncommon. It's 6 mana, 4/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, tap all creatures your opponent controls. All creatures your opponents control. So in Two-Headed Giant, it's even better. Can pretty much just win you a Two-Headed Giant game out of nowhere, or win you a one-on-one game. Look how aggressive all the creatures in white are. They've got plenty of creatures that are incentivizing you to attack, deal lots of damage, and if you can curve out into something that taps your opponent's entire party and then just swing past them, that is ridiculous. Not to mention you're adding 4 flying power to the battlefield. Obviously, if you're in a top deck, this card isn't going to save you. And if you are just racing and nobody has a field and you just hit this, it's a little bit underwhelming. But the fact that it supports the strategy and it supports the color so nicely, and just you can curve into this and win a game out of nowhere, leads me to believe that it is definitely first pickable material out of a pack that doesn't have a particularly outstanding rare. And then finally, Blessed Alliance. I will not say that Blessed Alliance is better or worse than any of these other uncommons on this page, but I do think it's very, very close between Alliance and the other 2 honorable mentions here, while I do think the nod goes to Subjugator Angel. Blessed Alliance just does a lot. For 2 mana, you can either gain 4 life, untap 2 creatures, or your opponent sacrifices an attacking creature. That last mode is already good for 2 mana in most situations. And then you can escalate it for 2 mana. So the sweet spot is 4 mana. For 4 mana, you're going to untap 2 creatures and your opponent sacks an attacking creature. That can just win you a combat out of nowhere, especially if you have the creatures to back it up. And then if you ever get to the point where you can tack on the additional 2 mana, gain in life in addition to those effects is pretty good. It lets you kind of stall on this card while giving you an incentive to, hold the Blessed Alliance back and then gain back some tempo swings. So this card does quite a bit. I will admit it's pretty bad in some situations. If your opponent's playing a go wide strategy with a ton of tokens, then that last part gets really much worse, but this card can definitely win you a race, and it goes very, very nicely in the color as well. So there you go. That's what I think. These are the cards you need to be looking out for as far as your sealed pool goes this following weekend, and draft in general. In particular, I was thinking about draft when I saw these cards. So these are the cards I would pick very highly, and also the cards I would take as a sign that a particular color is open. So if you're seeing a very late, maybe 4th, 5th pick Subjugator Angel, then white is probably open. Of course, I'm not an expert at the set. The set hasn't even come out yet, so it's very viable that some of my opinions will change over time, or maybe I'm just completely misevaluating the creature. So if you would, please leave a comment below and let me know what you either agree or disagree with. Also tell me, is there any other content you would like to see as far as Eldritch Moon goes? Is there anything else about the cards that you would like me to make a video for? If so, leave me a comment and I'll see what I can cook up for you. I do appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to watch this video, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so I can make more videos. I really enjoy it, and I really enjoy hearing feedback from people. Anyway, my name is Timothy. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.